It's amazing how often a chess game can boil down to just two kings and a single pawn on the board. And of course, if you're the side that has the pawn, you want to play for a win. You want to push that pawn to the other side and promote to a queen and win the game, right? If you are the side without the pawn, then you aren't able to win with just a king, but you would like to play for a draw, somehow blockade the pawn or win the pawn and cause a draw. And in this video, I want to show you some of the basics of this kind of pretty simple theoretical endgame, because it's amazing how often you can miss either a win or a draw that you really should have had just from not knowing the basics of king and pawn endings. So let's dive in. So the first, very, very basic, simple rule that you kind of need to know is if the king is not already in front of the pawn, then there's this so-called rule of the square. And what that means is you take the pawn and you draw a square on the chessboard, like that, based on how far it is from promotion. And kind of the rule is, if the opposing king can enter the square, then the king will be able to block the pawn. As long as the other king can't interfere, basically. And we'll talk about cases where the other king can assist the pawn in moving toward promotion as well. But if the defending king can enter the square, then it can block the pawn. Whereas if the defending king cannot enter the square, then it can't. And so this one here is kind of an extreme position, because it depends on whose move it is, right? So if it's black to move, then black can move over here or here and enter the square. Whereas if it's white to move, then white moves the pawn up one and the square is smaller and black can't get in. So in this example, it is white to move, and I'm just going to play this out against the computer. So let's turn on the computer here, and as white, I'm going to push this pawn, and then the computer doesn't even try. The computer knows that it can't win. I just push the pawn, and it's kind of boring. It can't actually win. I'm not sure why that just crashed. It seems like it's not letting me promote. So this is interesting. But turning the computer off for a second here, even if the computer tries to bring the king over and tries to stop this pawn, it cannot. The pawn will get to the end and promote. I don't know why that is not promoting. That's so weird that it's just leaving it as a pawn. Obviously there's a glitch. Let me just refresh my Lichess page. Let's try it again. I'm just curious. This is interesting. Wow, that is an interesting glitch. For some reason, it does not want to promote it. So anyway, there you go. Such is life. Let's look at the same one, but with the board flipped around the other way. So, and now in this endgame, it is black to move. And again, I'm going to play against the computer. So when it's black to move, now I can see that, as I mentioned, black can enter the square of the pawn. So I'm going to go over. White is going to try to promote, but I'm going to make it just in time. And then in this case, I noticed this when I played against the computer before. It's interesting. White, for some reason, rather than promoting to a queen and then losing that queen, it will promote to a bishop. And now Lichess doesn't allow me to continue because technically this is a draw. White does not have enough material to checkmate me. So that's kind of fun. So that's the case when the kings are sort of far away. You have to see whether the king is in the square of the pawn. What about when the kings are not so far away? So I'll play this one against the computer as well, but the rule to keep in mind now is when the pawn is not yet on the 5th rank, then you have 3 key squares, and those key squares are the 3 squares sort of in front of the pawn, like a T, that are 2 ranks in front of the pawn. And if you can manage to get the king onto one of those key squares, then with correct play, white can win in this scenario. Whereas if black can prevent white from getting onto those key squares, then it will be a draw. So in this case, it's actually interesting. You would think that white might want to go up here and try to prevent black from getting any closer, but if white does this, then black actually gains the opposition, and now white can never get onto these key squares, because if white dances around, black can just maintain opposition. But I'll turn on the computer player here. Yes, it's running. So what white can do is move over here, And then if black comes a little bit closer, I can get onto this key square right here. And so now with the correct procedure, you can promote the pawn. So typically you want to get opposition and then kind of flank to the side. And then this controls these squares for the pawn to move through. And so you can start moving the pawn up. And usually you want the king to end up on the 7th rank. I messed that up, but I can still win. So I'm going to move the pawn up first and then gain opposition and then go over here. And now I'm controlling these 3 squares, and I just push the pawn and get to the end. And again, we're not promoting to a queen for some reason. I don't know why that's happening. But that's the procedure. Now, it's a little bit different if the pawn is on the 5th rank. Now the key squares are actually, the 3 here, just in front of the pawn. So if the king can get to any of those squares, then with the correct moves, the white king can win this game. And I'll show you that. So I'll turn on the computer, and you would think that I would need to go here in order to gain opposition, and that does work, but I'll show you that even if I get to this key square in this position, it still works. And so actually black didn't even really try to put up a fight, which it could have by going here, but I'll show you that after. But you know, I can just push the pawn and then go up here, and again I'm covering all these squares, and I can promote. Just to show if white goes here and black gains opposition, then white can actually just push the pawn. Black can try to prevent, can try to blockade the pawn, but then when white pushes to the 7th rank, now black only has 1 move, and white can gain this square and promote. So again, key squares are, if the pawn is further back, then they are 2 ranks ahead. If the pawn is on the 5th rank, then they are 1 rank ahead. So here's kind of an extreme position where you kind of need to use all of this knowledge of key squares. So in this position, if it's white to move, then white has just enough time to get to one of these key squares and win the game. If it's black to move, then black can prevent white from getting to these key squares. So again, I'll play against the computer. It's white to move, and I'm just going to walk up and grab this key square, and let's just show, like, I don't even have to get opposition, because then if black takes opposition, I can just push the pawn once, and now I have opposition. So once black moves out of the way, I kind of flank to the side, and I'll do that again here. I think I can do that again here, and the pawn can get here in time. So yes, I'll do this, and then opposition and flank and push the pawn. And we get up here and we promote. And then if I switch the board around, actually this is kind of hilarious, because if I turn on the computer and play against the computer, so that this is the extreme position, the same one as I just showed you, but with black to move, and I'm playing as black, and the computer just gives up, like it just pushes the pawn for me to just capture it, because the computer is like, no, I have no way that I can win. But let's take a look at how it looks if white kind of tries a little bit harder, because there is an interesting technique here. So white might try to get onto the key squares, but when black gets opposition, now white can't make any progress, because black can just simply continue with opposition and keep blocking this king. If white tries to promote, or to push that pawn, then now what black needs to do is kind of always either retain the opposition or stay in front of the pawn. So black's going to go here, and if white pushes the pawn again, black just stays in front. White can push, black can gain opposition. White can push, black can stay in front. Now white kind of has opposition, but through this pawn, but black, again, the plan, we're just going to stay in front of this pawn. We're going to keep the opposition. If white pushes, we stay in front. We stay in front. We gain the opposition. And now if white pushes here, then black goes here, and this is different from the position we saw before where the pawn was on the 7th rank, because this is a Zugzwang position. White is the one with the move. If black was the one with the move here, black would have to move off to the side, white would gain the flank and promote the pawn. But since white has to move here, white cannot make a winning move. So if white moves to any of these squares, then black will just simply capture the pawn. And if white moves to this square, then this is actually a stalemate, because black cannot move to either of those two squares because of the king, and cannot move to either of those two squares because of the pawn. So this is pretty interesting. It's a pretty basic endgame, but I think it's pretty important. It's amazing how often, as I said, in a game, it actually simplifies all the way down to each side just has their king and one side has a single pawn. And you need to know kind of these techniques in order to gain the win or the draw that you deserve based on how the game has gone. So hope you enjoyed that video. I think this is a pretty useful skill to have and something to kind of practice and study. It's kind of interesting to practice some of these theoretical endgames against a computer, because endgames that are theoretically won, even if you play against a perfect computer bot, you can still win it, because that's just the way theoretical endings work. So it's kind of a fun way to practice it. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. If you're interested in another endgame video, you can check out this one, which will dive into a different basic endgame for you. And I will see you on the next one.